Hello and welcome to ThoughtCast, the SPJIMR podcast, a conversation about business and leadership between a corporate head and an academic. Today's episode is a really special one. SPJIMR's new Dean, Dr. Varun Nagaraj, is here today, and talking to him is Mr. Sunil Lulla, who is an industry stalwart. Dr. Nagaraj has joined us after 30 years of accomplished career in the Silicon Valley and Boston. Sunil is an alumnus of SPJIMR's class of 1984. He's had a stellar career with JWT, Grey, Sony, Times Television Network, Diageo, MTV for over 4 decades. So here is a conversation we are all waiting for. Sunil, over to you.
Thank you, Vinita. It's a privilege to be here. I'm a permanent student of SPJIMR, having passed out in 1984, and I don't think I have left those portals, and always been glad to be called by the Institute. It's a privilege to speak with Dr. Varun Nagaraj, who is a very accomplished professional and kept aside his professional career goals to come to India and spot the light on academics and to build a new wave of leaders and managers and to take those who study here on a big journey that he has in mind. I hope to be able to discuss his plans, his thinking about leadership, and his thinking about management. Please say hello to Dr. Varun Nagaraj. Varun?
Hi, Sunil. Nice to continue our conversation.
Yes, so for those of you who don't know him, he's a cyclist and he loves cycling. And have you discovered some new routes here in Bombay?
I hope to. Certainly I was run over by a bicycle in Juhu,
Oh,
but
God.
the person was pedaling on a fairly flat road. I like roads that are a bit hilly, so perhaps I think Lonavala and Khandala are in my future on a regular basis. In over the next couple of years, I think.
That's wonderful. If you can take the students and the alumni around, we can do a festival over there while you cycle.
Indeed, and I know Sunil, you're a runner, and I'll tell you something embarrassing, which is on some of the hills that my friends and I ride on. Sometimes the runners and sometimes even distressingly the walkers are faster than us who are on bicycles. So I think you might be able to outrace me even as I'm
Well,
panting up the hill.
whatever happens, nobody will outrace your mind and nobody will outrace your thinking. So let's talk about leadership in the current context. One of the aspirations and ambitions of people when they join an environment like SPJIMR is to be a better leader. And what is your vision of the leaders you hope to generate and create for this country over the next many years?
So it's a good question, Sunil. I think, we tend to deconstruct concepts like leadership maybe a little too easily. And certainly there's value in doing so. There are certain foundational skills that you would expect a leader to have. So if you begin with on the cognitive side, you would certainly expect a leader to have good analytical skills to be able to make sense, of a particular phenomenon or a situation. You would expect a leader to have good synthesis skills, being able to put together facts from different sources to paint a bigger picture than might be apparent. You would expect a leader to show the ability to actually inspire people, to set a clear direction, and so forth. So obviously, a lot has been written about leadership and different styles of leadership. Servant leadership being one which I find interesting, where a leader basically regards himself in the service of the people that he's expected to lead, not necessarily as somebody who is leading, if you will. So there are many models of leadership, but I think there are a few things that stand out, and especially if you look at from an SPJMR's point of view. And I think a lot of it comes down to sort of the quality of the person. So capabilities such as empathy, right? And empathy not just with your customer, like we're all taught to empathize, but empathy with the other stakeholders, empathy with the environment, the feeling that you're just one of many joined in a common collective cause. These are attributes that I think great leaders have. And these are attributes great leaders need to have if we are, in fact, to be a sustainable civilization. So I think what I would hope that SPJMR can continue to do, and all I'm really doing here is standing on the shoulders of those that have come before me, the founder, Dr. Shrikant, Ranjan Banerjee, the previous dean, and so forth, building on what it is that they have accomplished and started on, which is creating leaders who are good people, leaders who are empathetic people, leaders who are grounded, leaders who basically realize the consequences of their actions, leaders who care for a long term win-win proposition that multiple people can benefit from. If we can create that kind of leaders coming out of SPJMR, I think that would be a mission worth pursuing.
Yes, that's interesting because I think one we discussed this some time back, and you spoke about value oriented and value based growth and leadership, right? And that comes from the DNA maybe of what Bhavans has stood for many years. Would you like to share an insight on how you see value based growth being different, and how you see leaders who understand and walk that path being stronger performers and delivering better leadership?
Indeed, Sunil, I've probably been spending more time than a person should obsessing about that phrase, value based growth. At one level, it seems straightforward enough. But at another level, it has me still sort of pondering on how exactly should one interpret it. So a couple of things. One is when we talk about value based growth. So never mind what that phrase means. Let's just begin with growth. Whose value based growth are we talking about, right? At SPJMR, when we say our mission is to promote value based growth, it means oftentimes it's the value based growth of our students as individuals, as human beings, making sure that our students grow from the young impressionable students they might be, and I'm talking about our the full-time 2-year program. Obviously our students are in different parts of their life cycle depending on the program they join. But if I were to look at some of our younger students coming in, value-based growth could be really about helping shape the formative or the late formative years of their experiences so that they become better people, honestly, and better leaders. But I think it's an equally valid viewpoint to talk about value-based growth that an institute like SPJMR can drive, not just at the individual level, but also at sort of meta levels, if you will. How can SPJMR drive value-based growth for a company? Or what does value-based growth for a society mean? And one would argue that it's not just through teaching of individual students that an institute like SPJIMR can drive value-based growth. It is through the thought leadership that the faculty puts out. It's through the public discourse that the institute hopefully stimulates and facilitates. These are all sort of higher leverage points of driving value-based growth, not just for a student, but at an institutional level for companies, for industries, for sectors, and for society. So that's one aspect, but I still haven't answered the question as to, well, what does value-based growth mean, right? So I think you can look at it either as an input or as an output. If you take a look at it from an input perspective, value-based growth would probably imply that the person or the institution has a set of values, quote unquote values, that they live by that influences their behaviors and their actions. Now, the question here is, well, what are these values? And are there really universal human values? And we know today, for example, that while we would like to have universal values, different groups can have different interpretations of those particular values. So do values refer to quote unquote Eastern values? Do values refer to a strong sense of morality? Do values refer to family values? Do values refer to sort of adhering to scientific empirical thinking no matter what? All of these are different value systems, and to a large degree, many of them are valid value systems. So when we talk about inculcating values within our students or inculcating values within institutions, it's a reasonable question to ask, what exactly are these values? So I look at it and say, people have to deal with, or institutions have to deal with, multiple competing value logics. That's what we academics would refer to as a value system. If we call it a logic, right? And when you have these multiple logics, they sometimes can be in contradiction with each other. So let me point out, maybe family values might indicate that family loyalty comes above all. On the other hand, values of morality and ethics and ethical behavior might indicate that honesty comes above all. I think we've all been in situations where we may have had a family member that didn't necessarily reflect, the latter value. How then do you reconcile your family values with your ethical values if they happen to be in conflict with each other? So values, I think, are a tricky thing if you look at it from an input perspective. I think we all agree that there are certain sort of core values that make sense, but oftentimes these value systems can be in contradiction with each other. So what I'd hope we can create is a framework in which these competing values can basically be looked at as a package to drive the right behaviors. I am actually a lot more comfortable with the notion of value based growth as an output, right? As an attribute of growth. And here I can get my arms around it quite fully by saying, growth that is inclusive, right? That doesn't leave anybody behind. Growth that is sustainable, where you don't compromise, the long term for short term gains. Growth that is ethically driven. These are sort of attributes of growth that are output attributes of growth. So I think you can interpret it in terms of inputs, if and it could work for a lot of folks. My only caution is sometimes perfectly legitimate value systems can be in slight conflict with each other. Or you can look at it in terms of outputs.
No, absolutely. I think, but if you look at a spate of recent events in the Indian media, it's all been about that, where shareholders and boards are now seemingly at conflict because of actions of either shareholders, boards, or management. So it's an important turning point in the current business history of India as we develop further to ensure that the spread of value based growth not only goes in part of a teaching program to those aspiring to be leaders, but also is spread around the current leadership that exists. So I think you should say more and do more about it, both in your capacity as dean, as an institute, and in terms of shaping public opinion policy.
I agree, Sunil. I think, as you were mentioning, sort of if you look at the means and the end, I think, the means can sometimes be chaotic, and I think it's easy to get lost in the means. They do matter, of course.
Yes,
But I think it's a lot easier to start, as somebody said, with the end in mind, and with a set of goals in mind. And so to me, I like to begin with value based growth as kind of a desirable end state, growth with certain attributes, with multiple paths. Hopefully, all of them are conscientious and all of them are ethical, but multiple paths to get there.
that's great. Actually, it takes me to another point because there's an opportunity that lies there. When with the onset of the pandemic and everybody turned digital, and you were unfortunately had to suspend the physical classroom, even Harvard struggles to define what is a classroom that engages students today. What is your view of where we are today as as a country and as the world, so to speak, of modern education? How we conduct our classrooms? What's going to be the future over the next 5 years, even though the world may be hybrid for some more time? And is there really going to be a physicality to this?
Right. So I think it's a good question, Sunil. I think it has forced us all to re-examine what education is, when it happens, how it's delivered. And I think a few things hopefully will be different, in a positive way going forward. One is, I think we've always paid lip service to the fact that education is a lifelong process. But I think basically the pandemic showed it can be a lifelong process, because if there isn't that much difference between what and how you learn as a full-time student versus how you learn as a professional, it's the same kinds of techniques and technologies. Well, then suddenly being a lifelong student doesn't just feel like an aspirational goal. It just feels like something that you do all the time, thanks to technology. So I think that's one dimension, and I hope that influences what we do at SPJIMR a whole lot as well. The notion that education is not something that is bound by a couple of years or to a program, but is a lifelong process. And we can talk about that and what does that mean for alumni and an ongoing alumni SPJIMR relationship going forward. The second part, and again, something we have always agreed on, I think, especially in business schools, is that students learn a lot more from their peers and from their circumstances than they necessarily do from, quote unquote, the teacher, right? We have a long history sometimes of going back to the Gurukul tradition. And while those are very good foundational blocks, the fact is a lot of modern contemporary learning happens from peer learning and from situational learning. And I think here there are some interesting new trends that are emerging. I did my MBA at Boston University, and I was attending a meeting where they were discussing a new online program that they had launched. And a student in that online program who had attended the University of California at Berkeley for 4 years and lived on campus, for 3 of those 4 years, basically was noting that he had built a stronger sense of community in an all online context with with the cohort of students in an online MBA relative to living on campus as a young undergrad at Berkeley, which is a great place to be in. But relative to that, he claimed he actually had built a stronger sense of community, and therefore his learning from his peer group was actually much higher.
Why so? Why did he say that? What was different or motivating, differentiating?
So if you look at it and sort of say what did he get out of it, I think the point was you were able to make multiple communities. I think in the physical world, when you're think about us when we were young college students in a dorm, the amount of time you spend, which is all good time, with a group of friends, you're not able to context switch between multiple groups. It's a lot harder to form social groups and switch between them as easily as it is in the virtual world. Lots of downsides to social networking. I'm not sitting and promoting social networking and in all its forms, but I'm saying for the sake of peer networking around topics of interest, peer networking around a project or around an idea, it's a lot easier in the online world, I think, to create subsets of people that might have specific interests to you and learn from them at a faster pace than if you were trying to do it in person. So I think that was probably the reason why he felt a sense of community, and maybe the level of interactivity and all that was higher than he was, what he had experienced in his undergrad days.
So that's like if you recall ham radios and the communities that they generated. Not I think not legitimate in India today, but if I'm not mistaken, you're referring to that, right? It is the ham radios of the 20s and 30s and 40s, and today we are in 2020, and it's still relevant in terms of its basic concept and appeal.
I agree, Sunil, but I will warn you that by referencing ham radios, and a good friend of mine was a big ham radio enthusiast, I think you are dating you and me quite a bit for our
No,
younger audience
that's,
here.
we know history. That's all we are saying, that we are well versed in history. Don't worry about this. So that brings me to a question, right? Management education begins with two books, one slapped on your left or one on your right. One is Peter Drucker, the other is Philip Kotler. Still relevant today?
Not really, I think, right? See, so the thing about management education to me is, so I wouldn't call them students. Let's just talk about the young professionals today, many of who, I've had the pleasure of leading and mentoring and so forth through their careers. Where do they get their information from? Where do they learn from? I do think there was a spate of bestseller books, right? I mean, so let's look at the quote unquote management pantheon of books, if you will. So you tend to have books that are quite timely. For example, if you were in the tech industry, Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore was a classic. You could argue it was a repackaging of several marketing concepts around how technology diffusion happens and so on, but it was brilliantly written and applicable to its time. So I always think that you have these very contemporary books over and above Drucker and Kotler, that tend to hit upon a particularly resonant theme. So you have those kinds of books probably every couple of years. But I think what you've seen more recently, and then you have the kind of books that really annoy me, which are the great man books, right?
Yeah,
An
of course.
individual great person saying this is what worked for me, and then you go, okay, well, whatever.
And the how-to
Yeah,
series.
the checklist, right? 15 ways you can be a successful entrepreneur and so forth. So let's leave that genre of books aside because I don't think they're legitimate. What's interesting is basically the proliferation of blogs, if you will, and a lot of people sharing information, right? So there's been a democratization of information, and we all know all the downsides of it, as in fake news and misinformation and disinformation and so on. But in the professional world, let's say you were looking at product management, right, which is a very contemporary position, a highly desirable position for young MBAs, and it's I think a very foundational kind of a job. So if you look at sort of product management and where do people learn how to become a good product manager, it's not from any of the textbooks. It's from each other. It's from communities of product managers, and it's from blogs, maybe written by 100,000, active product managers who have something to share. Now, what you need to have is the ability to discern, the wheat from the chaff, because there is a lot of, poorly written stuff there. You also need to have the ability to hold these, what I was calling logics, right? Competing logics, because there is one product manager who might swear upon a particular technique that works for him or her, and another product manager has a completely counter or opposite view. So you as a student need to be a far more, or as a young professional, need to be a far more discerning consumer of information, because you are going to get conflicting pieces of information that you need to sort of work through. There isn't one Kotler telling you, here's what you need to do. So I think the pedagogical capabilities, the delivery approach and the capabilities of the person imbibing the knowledge have to be different now than they were before. I think the notion of one authoritative source of information is passé. I think what you're going to have are a whole bunch of context specific ideas and thoughts democratized, coming from people without, quote unquote, the formal qualifications. But in some cases, that might be the best thinking. But the consumer has to be sophisticated enough to wade through it and to put it together.
So one of the things you expressed earlier in a narrative is the nature of change of education to shape thinking, to shape leaders, to shape behavior and action and knowledge. And I think you called it centers of development for excellence, right? And you talked about in the context of shaping innovation, policy, influencing diversity, and things like that. Would you like to shed some light on your thinking around this?
See, universities, I think, have a interesting tool available to them, which are centers. Centers are cross-functional, cross-disciplinary platforms or forums meant for a pretty specific purpose in my mind. They're meant to influence public opinion. They're meant to facilitate dialogue between people who normally might not be engaged in dialogue. They're meant to take the fruits of knowledge and bring it to community in some sort of a useful manner. So they're really tools of conversation and tools of information dissemination and influence. And I think it's a wonderful construct. And different universities have used centers differently to achieve these types of objectives. Now, at SPJIMR, where we have and have been guided by a clear visions and a clear mission since our founding days of influencing practice and promoting value-based growth that we talked about at length. The question is, what are some platforms that can be created in order to drive this? So, for example, social innovation or social impact brings two things that are near and dear to my heart together and near and dear to SPJIMR's heart together. There's a notion of innovation, and whether it's digital or not, I think that is critical in today's world. But then there's the notion of applying that digital innovation towards a social good, not just towards creating the next gaming platform or something. So I think there are these intersections between traditional disciplines that are extremely pertinent to society going forward. And centers are a good way of sort of rallying around these big agenda items. That is an area that I hope that we can make a fair bit of progress on during my tenure here at SPJIMR. So that's the reason I'm kind of excited about that particular form of influence and form of delivery.
So, the Prime Minister says in 5 years he wants to see India be a $5 trillion economy. As an alumni, as a professional, as a person who's very vested with the Indian dream, I would love to see us grow there. What role can this institute play and you play to drive the leadership that you influence to get closer to this goal?
So, as we discussed, influence can come through teaching and through your students directly. And obviously, you're dependent upon the success of the students. Now, the wonderful thing about SPJIMR and its alumni are the fact that our students, our former students, have been tremendously successful. They've been tremendously successful in creating, hopefully, the kind of growth that we're talking about. However, as we're looking to scale to the extent that you're talking about, that the Prime Minister is talking about, you're not going to be able to scale through a few thousand students a year that you touch. So we need to examine if there are ways of actually touching and influencing many more souls in a given year than we currently do. So that notion of scale can come in multiple ways. It can come by way of us expanding the number of students we touch through many more programs. It can come by way of expanding the length of a touch point. And that's the reason I'll come back to the lifelong learning that we can talk about later. But teaching allows us, done right, will allow us to scale and support the goal you're talking about. But I don't think it's enough. I think thought leadership and community discourse and dissemination. So it doesn't have to be leadership in terms of thought coming purely from us. It can be leadership demonstrated through our ability to bring in the best ideas and disseminate them. I think becomes key to what it is that we need to do to get to that kind of a number. And in specific areas, we cannot be everything to everybody. I think we have some strengths. And if we can essentially direct innovation and channel innovation into productive outlets, whether they be towards improving social outcomes or whether they be towards improving equity and so forth, I think we can make sure that the growth that happens, because hundreds of people, organizations are going to be pushing towards the growth, and I hope they're all successful. If we are able to sort of shape the value elements of those growth, and come and play at that intersection of innovation and value, I think that would be a tremendous contribution from us.
So just to change gears a bit, I reached out to a number of ex-students, alumni of the institute, and they had a couple of questions. I'm just going to bundle them together, where many of them have expressed interest to move from industry to academia. So they want to understand, how would you encourage people to move towards academia?
Sure thing. I'd have to sort of start off with a caveat saying, much as we'd love to hire every single SPJIMR alum who
No,
wants to
no,
come
please
into
don't. I'll
academia.
give you a list of those you shouldn't hire. I'm kidding.
Yeah, no. So first of all, I think it's a wonderful thing. I think the artificial line between academia and practice, the more it gets blurred, the better off we are. The notion of practitioner scholarship or a scholarly practitioner, I think these are phrases we should use more often versus just strictly say there's a world of practice and there's a world of academia. Now they are different, mind you. Academia prizes rigor, practice prizes relevance, but good research should basically be, new knowledge that is rigorously derived, but that is also relevant in some manner. So if there are folks in industry that are looking to get involved in academia, I think there are lots of steps to take to figure out if that is in fact right for you. I would say the easiest path to take is that of essentially trying to teach in an adjunct capacity, or to teach in at least a visiting session scholar or visiting session practitioner capacity. I think that will give you, as a industry practitioner, a good sense of whether you actually like it or not. And Sunil, I'll digress a little bit here. Just to make a point that sometimes things that look appealing and that are fun to do in small measures are not necessarily what you want to do in large measures. And I think this is an important thing for industry practitioners
Valuable.
to keep in mind. And the small digression I will make is the fact that, when I was a young engineer in California working for Hewlett Packard, I always had fancied myself as an aspiring actor. And I had an opportunity to actually play, for 9 months in a semi-professional theater group that performed every Friday and Saturday. It was the oldest running show in theater in California, oldest continuously operating theater in California since the gold rush. I had an opportunity to perform there for 9 months, every Friday and Saturday. And by the end of the 9th month, I was so happy that the show was completing. And the thought that, I would have been a professional actor, in hindsight, I was so glad I hadn't gone down that route. I didn't have the talent to, thankfully. But I had not gone down that route, because something that was so pleasurable in short doses became a chore, when you had to do it over and over again. And I think something like academia, if you begin with the teaching aspect of it, would be a good thing to test out with these kinds of baby steps. The research aspects, to the extent that our alumni want to get involved, there are great ways of collaborating with existing academics to sharpen the research questions that academics are looking for. Academics always have research questions that, would benefit from being made more relevant. And academics are always looking for data sets, which industry practitioners have. So collaborating with your favorite faculty member on a project or two is yet another way of testing out as to whether you really want to move into academia or not.
Thank you. So that's very valuable. And I got a sense you're saying you talked about acting, right? You acted when you were in college. So one more thing Bombay has is Bollywood. Varun, we could take you across if you would like to test yourself over there. Yeah?
So I don't know if they have a movie they're making called The Man with Two Left Feet, but if they are making a movie with a man with two left feet, I'm there for the
Please leave
dancing
yourself in my
sequence.
good hands and see what I can do with you then. So, there's I'm sure in India you're seeing a very big change if you come to this country often. And that change is a hyphenated word called startup, right? And we are seeing startups grow fast, gain value, deliver service, create innovation, really put some, important things over there. Paytm, as an example, made digital payments really accessible, and many such others. One of the fears people have in a startup, and I'm talking not from a startup point of view, but the conventional legacy business point of view here, is that that gap between MBA and non-MBA is closing, because MBA the startup guys are not necessarily MBA. Some of them are engineer MBA, some are non. It doesn't matter. And therefore, the question from the student community is, this is a premier institute, and how will you add value to my education, and how will you be able to consistently attract talent to come here versus me going and doing a startup and making sure I take something which is really valuable out here so that I can influence industry.
Everybody, I think, feels that there is a startup or two inside of them, or many people feel that, right? But I do think, having worked with a lot of entrepreneurs over the last 30 years, I will say, if you really reflect upon yourself, you reflect upon folks, people fall into two categories. There are those that actually have the ability to take that huge leap of faith, that first step into the unknown. And there aren't that many people of that nature. Everybody likes to think they are that person. But if I were being brutally honest, I would probably say maybe 1 out of 10 people has that kind of a sort of confidence and capability set. And by that, I don't mean educational capability set. I mean, there's a certain chutzpah you need in order to basically go take that first leap of faith. Now, does somebody like that, does an Elon Musk have an MBA? Does a Steve Jobs have an MBA? Does, take the other folks that are starting newer companies? And the fact is, no, right? But they are different people. The fact is, every startup has an employee number three and a four and a five and so forth. And to that degree, yes, you are part of the startup. You just don't happen to be the first person who took that giant leap. And there is no dishonor in that. Now, employees number three, four, five, six are coming in to sort of plug the holes, if you will, that the startup founder, the number one or the number two person, and I just mean in terms of timing, right? Not in terms of seniority or anything. They come in to plug the holes that the others, the founders would have. And so, to me, there is a need for people who are brilliant coders. There's a need for people who are, strong analytical, financial geniuses. There is a need for amazing marketeers. Now, a founder may have, shades of all of these things, and sometimes their intuition around things, especially like marketing and positioning, may in fact be much stronger than somebody who's been formally trained. But again, as I said, that is a subset of people. I would say, for the vast majority of folks, it makes sense to build up skills in specific areas. You will have an opportunity to work with these brilliant visionary geniuses. You will also have an opportunity to figure out if you're one of them. And at which point, the fact that you also happen to have sort of some formal training in certain methods, isn't a negative in many ways. So yes, can people become rich, famous, and impact change, without an education of any sort? They can. You have Peter Thiel in California, who basically has a scholarship targeted at dropouts. His whole premise is going to college is a highly dangerous thing. That is a point of view, right? And he basically wants people dropping out. So you always have those kinds of situations where you have folks that say education doesn't matter. But I think, but I think if you sort of take it in a sort of a more sort of practical, broadly applicable sense, I do think the kinds of things that one would learn at SPJIMR, the kinds of things one would learn as an engineer at IIT and so forth, I think those things still remain relevant to actually building businesses that can scale.
So one last question for you is, I'm sure you see Hindi movies, right? Varun? So
Yes, but
which
perhaps
Hindi
perhaps
movie
not as.
doesn't matter. Which I don't care if it's KL Saigal. Okay, which Hindi movie would you like see being filmed at the SPJIMR campus? And don't say Three Idiots.
That's been taken at presumably one of my old alma mater
Yes, it
campuses.
has. It
Though I
has.
believe it was actually shot
Yeah,
somewhere
and
else.
Bombay Sapphire College has played a big role in many of the OTT and movies, as an example. So I'm asking you that, if we were to give our campus away for a few hours, to which Hindi movie of the past would we like to give it to?
That's a good question, Sunil. I think I would still have to say it has to be mission aligned in some way, right? So I don't quite see the campus. By the way, it's a lovely campus, as many of us know, and I could see it being a good ground for some plain vanilla romance or rom com kinds of movies and so on. But that just feels so pedestrian.
No, Varun, it's
So
exactly that. And I'll tell you why. There are so many love stories which started at SPGN, including my own. Okay? So I was going to say 1942, a love story.
which I know, Sunil, you were born after 1942,
Yeah, so
but
that's why we can use
yeah.
our imagination, right? But actually, the more
So
modern
yes,
thinking is Mission Impossible, right? Because you said that,
yeah, no, I was trying to be mission aligned, and I was trying
yeah.
to be a good SPJMR, citizen here, sort of saying there probably is some sort of an inspiring story that brings together success and loss and failure and eventual triumph, but all done with the goodness of humanity shining through. So if somebody has a script for that, please approach me for filming rights on
Done,
campus.
I'll be there tomorrow morning. So, Varun, thank you for your time. I have had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Varun Nagaraj. This was not an interview. I hope this inspires all those who have listened to understand contemporary leadership, how we can shape our businesses, our minds, and our abilities. I truly believe that the freshness that he is bringing to SPJMR and to the country at this point of time is unique. And I'm really hoping that he, the faculty, the students, and everybody else play a great role in truly shaping our march towards being a $5 trillion economy and more. Thank you, Varun. Is there any closing comments you would like?
Sunil, I just want to thank you for being, so generous with, with your praise, if you will. I certainly hope to live up to at least some of what you have laid out as things that I really should be doing, both for the institute and for the country. But thank you very much. I had a lovely time talking
Thank you,
with you
Venita.
too.
Over to you.
It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Sunil and Varun. You were listening to SPJIMR's ThoughtCast, produced by Vinita Dwivedi, edited by Amulya, supported by Pani, Rishabh, and Kaushik. Thank you for listening.